Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first of three intermezzi that we'll have, which you can rest your voices and find some intellectual enrichment and food for thought, we hope, over the course of the next few days. We're really so pleased to have the participation of, you know about our collaborations between St. John's and Mater Ecclesiae, as well as the Archdiocese here. But I also want to mention the Collegium Institute, which has been wonderful in supporting our efforts, as well as the Durandus Institute as well. So you'll notice their insignia on the front of our book. And so we're grateful for their support and also their interest in this project. So I have the wonderful opportunity to introduce our speaker today, who is really, you know, I don't have to go to great lengths to introduce him, because I know that all of you are very aware that Sir James MacMillan is with us, and I think that both Peter and I were, when we, as he said yesterday, that we really were hoping to get a real great headliner to be with us, and we kind of found ourselves now starting at the top, so which is going to be difficult to go forward from this. So James, of course, is a distinguished composer, writing in many different forms, from opera to symphonic music, concerti, choral music, choral orchestral works of great repute and high acclaim. His associations professionally are very wide. He had been a composer and conductor with the BBC Philharmonic from 2000 to 2009. He has an extensive career as a conductor, and we're very privileged to be engaging him in that capacity here. We're all very excited about that. He's an honorary fellow of Blackfriars Hall at Oxford, patron of St. Mary's Music School in Edinburgh, the London Oratory School, along with Simon Callow, Princess Michael of Kent. He's been appointed patron of the British Art Music Series. In 2004, he was appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire, CBE, so you see that after his name. And in 2015, a Knight Bachelor. 2008, he became an honorary patron of the London Chamber Orchestra's LCO New Explore project, which explores links between music and other art forms and fosters emerging creative talent and composition. What I'll leave you with before we listen to Sir James' presentation is the good example that he sets for us as musicians and artists, and those who are interested in composition, to be engaging with people in various fields. There's a real strong emphasis in his work, both in his work as a musician and composer, but also in his work intellectually and cultural commentator, to draw together all of these different threads in our world that are such important consequence for human culture. And I will mention that he's part of a very interesting project, an MLit program at the University of St. Andrew, where he's on the faculty in sacred music, sacred arts, and theology. And so I just want to call that to your attention, and hopefully we can share some more information about that with you all. So without further ado, Sir James MacMillan, thanks.
Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, Tim and Peter, for inviting me here to take part in this conference this week. It's a great delight to be back in the United States. At one point last year, I honestly thought I would never be able to get out of the house at all ever again, and it was a very sad thought that I would never get back to the United States, but here I am. And one of the reasons for that is that I was working in Vermont last week at a chamber music festival, and the organisers there were able to get me a special visa. You're probably aware that the air corridors haven't opened up yet between the United States and the United Kingdom. Actually, just in the last few days that Americans are now able to fly to Britain, but not vice versa at the moment, although that might change any day. Hopefully it will. My wife had hoped to come with me on the trip, but she couldn't on a tourist visa. But the Vermont people managed to get me an NIE visa. It's a special visa, a work visa. And I was on the back of that, I was able to come immediately to this wonderful conference and take part in the activities this week. So I'm very grateful for that. So I've been asked to talk about composing sacred music in the 21st century. I suppose it needs a little bit of unpacking. First of all, I will speak subjectively. I will speak as a composer in the 21st century. I'll try to give some kind of insight about what it means to write sacred music in the 21st century. A little bit of unpacking of the music, and I'll play some examples of what I've done. But before we even get to that, there are certain contexts that are worth pursuing, and the plural is important here because a number of people will want to describe sacred music in different ways. We are, of course, used to talking about sacred music in the liturgy or for the liturgy, as is the case this week. But we also know that beyond the confines of conferences like this, there are many people who will talk about sacred music, who will want to explore their love of sacred music, but in a secular world. In fact, you'll meet many people who will say things like, all music is sacred. So between the two extremes of music for liturgy and all music is sacred, there's a lot to be discussed. So there's a kind of almost pantheistic view, I think, about all music is sacred. It's not a view I disagree with. There is something about certainly the music that I love, for example, I'm involved in, and I suppose there, when I talk about all music, I'm talking about secular music and instrumental music, symphonic music, as well as the choral music that is probably the focus of a week like this. There is something about all that music which opens up a window on the divine, and many people who may not necessarily share our particular faith are open to that possibility of being changed through the power of music. And you'll find many people, skeptical, agnostic types perhaps, who will say things like music is the most sacred of the arts. And I think we've got to acknowledge a truth in that. We may mean something quite specific when we say music is the most sacred of the arts, the most spiritual of the arts. But the fact that there are many people out there in the secular world who share our love of music, who are of a similar mind, is a wonderful bedrock in which to build shared experiences and shared ideas about this music, about this art form that we love. Now, I suppose most of the time I write music for that secular world. Most of the time my working energies are taken up thinking about a new work for the concert hall. Sometimes these are symphonic works, sometimes these are purely instrumental works, sometimes they are pieces for chamber choir, chamber ensemble, and so on. But sometimes also they are settings of texts as well. And I've written 2 passion settings so far, and these were not written for liturgy, they were written for concert performance. And I suppose we know that there's quite a long history now of classical music engaging with the sacred, but presenting it in a secular forum. Right, going back to Handel's oratorios, which were presented as sacred concerts and would have been applauded, I would imagine, in the early days, through the likes of Mendelssohn writing his Elijah oratorios and St. Paul and so on for secular presentation. performed by secular choral societies through Verdi's Requiem, of course, and right through to the likes of Edward Elgar in my own country, who wrote his one of his great masterpieces, The Dream of Gerontius, which is one of my favourite works, and I'd love to be able to bring it over here and see it performed more in the United States. But here is a composer I'd like to perhaps begin with, because in many ways Elgar was one of these figures at the turn of the century, between the 19th and 20th century, who sat on the cusp between the sacred and the secular. He was a Catholic, and when he was given this opportunity to write his most ambitious work as a relatively young composer, it must have been quite a foolhardy decision that he made to take a very Catholic subject. Gerontius is about purgatory, and it's a setting of that great poem by John Henry Newman, known to Catholics at the time, but not really known beyond the Catholic community in England in the 19th century. And Elgar was writing The Dream of Gerontius at a time when the Catholic community in England was still under a great deal of suspicion, and indeed under a great deal of lack of empathy and even aggression. Only a few years before Elgar's birth, the Catholic emancipation had taken place in England, and even during Elgar's birth, Catholics were not allowed to attend Oxford or Cambridge universities. There was a lot of antipathy and nervousness about Catholics like Elgar, which have roots in the Reformation, of course, and you could say that even today that there are remnants of that suspicion around, although they've kind of transmogrified in different directions in different countries, and we might be able to talk about that later on. But for Elgar to have chosen this very Catholic subject, knowing that he would have been subject to a lot of criticism from the majority Protestant community, the Protestant culture of his time, points to, I think, a deep bravery and courage in the man himself. And I think, as I say, The Dream of Gerontius is one of his great masterworks. It's interesting, though, that Elgar lost his faith gradually after the composition of The Dream of Gerontius, and there's much speculation about why that was. Was it, in fact, a reaction to the antipathy that he encountered as a Catholic composer coming into the establishment? The Dream of Gerontius was banned for many years in places in England. The repeat performances were refused in certain places during the first decade. Bowdlerized versions of it were presented at the Three Choirs festivals with all the Marian references and references to purgatory taken out. You could just imagine what that must have been like. So he must have felt the pain of what it must have been like to have been rejected as a minority figure in a majority Protestant society. And that might have been one of the reasons he lost his faith. Also has to be said that gradually through his more secular works, he became the darling of the establishment. He became known as the quintessentially English composer of the Edwardian era. And he may have been seduced by that, with the fame and the success that came with becoming known as the mouthpiece for a new English Edwardian nationalism. He's regarded as the English nationalist composer of the period, and perhaps to regress back to the religion of the martyrs and the saints might have been too much for him. It's a very complex figure indeed, and for me as a Catholic composer at the cusp of the 20th and 21st century, he's someone I've reflected on a lot. So there is that background, of course, to this discussion. Yes, music for the liturgy is very important, and even the music that I've just discussed by Handel and Mendelssohn and Verdi and Elgar find a lot of their roots in the liturgical tradition. There is an experience and a knowledge amongst those who love music, that the music they love has come from a special place culturally. And there is a respect for that. There's a respect within the community who love music for the Catholic and Protestant roots of much of the music that they listen to at Easter time. They may go and hear the Bach Passions at Easter time in concert performances. They know where that music has come from, historically, culturally, and I'm delighted to say that there is a deep respect, and certainly I've encountered a deep respect for my religion, my faith, from amongst those people who share my love of music, but may not share my religion. Apart from the odd review in papers like The Guardian, which is our equivalent of the New York Times, and sometimes you get a bit of a pushback from radical anti-religious minds in these places, of course, and you're probably aware of that. Nevertheless, I found a receptive openness, an open-heartedness, an open-mindedness, an open-earedness to the fact that there is a Catholic composer writing music for their world. And in many ways, I have been given encouragement by looking at the 20th century and seeing major figures who were great composers and men and women of faith. If you think about the likes of Stravinsky, who set the Psalms, who set the Mass, who set little prayers like the Ave Maria and the Credo, and yet he was one of the pillars of early modernism. That other great polar opposite of his, Arnold Schoenberg, reconverted to a practicing Judaism after he left Germany, and much of his later work is infused with not just a Jewish spirit, but a Jewish theology, and indeed his Jewish culture. Olivier Messiaen was famously Catholic, of course, and I look at these composers and their example and the fact that they emerged as major figures in the era of modernity, in the era of where we talk about the lack of faith or the retreat of faith, and yet in music, in musical modernity, there have been these figures who have kept a flame alive and have made it clear that they are in a constant search of the sacred. So to put some of that in context when it comes to my own music, as I say, I've written a couple of passion settings already. I'm going to show you a little bit of my St. John Passion in a minute. But just a few years ago, I wrote my 5th symphony, which was a choral symphony. I wrote it for the 16. There are 2 choirs in orchestra. The 16 was the chamber choir. Genesis 16 which was the training academy. There was the big choir, the big symphonic choir, and the orchestra. And in essence, this symphony, subtitled Le Grand Inconnu, is a kind of exploration of the Holy Spirit. And we've presented it twice in the United Kingdom at the Edinburgh Festival in Scotland, and then at the Barbican in London, to an entirely secular audience, of course. But I think there is a thirst, and you've probably noticed it as well, within the wider culture, especially those who love the arts and music in particular, for a deep sense of spirituality. They're very vague when they talk about these things, of course, but we as Catholics have centuries, at least centuries, of an engagement with the search for the Spirit, for spirituality, in the third person of the Blessed Trinity. And to be able to explore the idea of the Holy Spirit in a piece of secular music was what felt as if it was a way of inviting these people into my world, into the world of the Spirit, into the world of God, and to do it in quite an open way. Just to give you an idea, I wanted to set as many different little fragments of poetry as I could that pointed towards the Holy Spirit. I found some wonderful texts by St. John of the Cross. I found bits of scripture, Old and New Testament, found little bits of hymnody. But to begin with, I began with sounds. I began with the sound of human beings breathing. And in fact, the first movement is called Ruach, which is the Hebrew word for breath, which also means spirit. And as you'll hear, if we can get this to work, you'll hear that the first thing is the choir. There's about 60 of them breathing in and out. The choir, the orchestra add their own breathing sounds of sorts to this, and then gradually we hear the word ruach being enunciated by the altars, and gradually thereafter there are other words like pneuma, which is the ancient Greek for the same thing, breath or spirit, and spiritus, which is the Latin for breath and spirit. The second movement is called zau, which is the ancient Greek for living water. We also hear the Hebrew version of this, Mayim Chaim, living water, and in the Latin aquam viventem. So you can see in the exploration of sounds and images relating to those physical energies associated with the Holy Spirit, breath, water, and then fire. The last moment is about fire. Here's a way of exploring in sound and in music something that we all share, a search that we all share, a search for the sacred. So here is the beginning of, or part of the beginning of the Ruach movement, the first movement. So we can get this to work. I have a trusted assistant who's going to help me out if it goes wrong. Can you hear that? before I get on to the discussion of liturgy, I want just to say a little bit about one of my passion settings, which is the St. John Passion. As I've said before, I wrote it for concert performance. It was co-commissioned by the London Symphony Orchestra originally, conducted by Sir Colin Davis. It has a baritone soloist as Christus, a narrator's choir, and a large chorus and orchestra. One of the co-commissioners was the Philadelphia Orchestra. The Boston Symphony Orchestra. Sorry about that. And Colin Davis conducted it in Boston. Another of the co-commissioners was the Berlin Radio Choir, and I want to show you a little video clip of how they did it. It is a concert piece, but they suggested that there could be a collaboration with a theatre director and a dancer. This happens quite a lot to me. I involve myself in many interesting collaborations. So this was, in essence, a concert performance, but the singer, the baritone, acted and moved in a small way, but he also interacted with the dancer, who was a kind of another representation of Christ. So there was two ways of representing Christ. There was Christ the singer and Christ the dancer. And again, as I said, for very much a secular audience, a post-Christian audience. I felt quite comfortable with the way they did it. I watched them closely just in case anything wasn't right, but I thought it was a very profound performance and interpretation. So what you'll see here is a little video clip. Sometimes the images don't quite match up with the music you're hearing, but you will hear some of the music. But you'll see a little bit of what they did. And I should perhaps give a little bit of a trigger warning. I think that's the term that you have these days, because the first few images are quite stark. I don't want anyone to be overtly offended by it. I remember at the time it was quite a shock when I first saw it. So you have been warned. Right.
ist ein Mensch, der berührt mit seinen nackten Füßen Sand, Steine auf dem Weg zu seiner Hinrichtung.
Something to me. It's not just a story, it's a living tale. It's something that has a spirit that is alive in our time.
I think the important thing about this piece is that it really connects to the story. James is a believer, and that the music comes from the heart and from the belief in Jesus Christ, his crucifixion and what that meant.
The main character, obviously in this story, is Jesus. And the way I wrote it for a baritone singer. But the way that this production has come together, it involves bringing the baritone into the action. He sings, but he interacts with another dimension, another presentation of Jesus, who is the dancer.
Wo liegt die Kraft im Zerbrechlichen? Wo liegt die Kraft in der Schwäche? Wo liegt die Kraft in der Demut, in der bewussten Zerbrechlichkeit, in der Hingabe? Die Ästhetik der ganzen choreografischen Sprache schöpft, glaube ich, sehr aus dem Spannungsfeld zwischen Bewegung und Stillstand.
The producer, by combining the two figures, allows different ways in to see different dimensions of the character of Jesus. It makes a marvellous counterpart to the music. I'm thrilled to see what the choreographer has done, what the production staff have done with the visual element. It's almost like a Gesamtkunstwerk.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm probably the first to admit that it's quite an odd situation to find oneself being a composer who's at home in the business of serious arts music and its modernity, and simultaneously being interested in what might work as functional ritual music in the Catholic liturgy in the times in which we live. As I say, most of my work is geared towards the concert life of our orchestras, chamber ensembles, soloists, conductors, and choirs. The culture of art music, as it evolves now in the 21st century, is my intellectual and imaginative home. In earlier times, this kind of work would naturally have overlapped with composing music for liturgy, whether it be the weekly cantatas written by J.S. Bach for Lutheran worship, or the regular masses and motets composed by Palestrina through Mozart towards Bruckner and beyond. We don't need to rehearse the historical and cultural reasons why there have been breaches between ecclesial authorities and classical composers. Gradually over the decades, one, I suppose, has become more and more disinterested in the other. So much so that it is thought unusual to find composers enthusiastically pursuing both aspirations. It might only be recently that this breach has become serious, as we can think of many composers, even as late as the 20th century, who did follow the two paths. Poulenc and Mstislav in France, Benjamin Britten in the United Kingdom, and as I say, even Stravinsky with his mass setting and his little motets like Ave Maria and Pater Noster. With the Second Vatican Council, though, came another serious breach. It has become almost impossible, I think, for the Church to interest the contemporary art composer in writing new congregational music for the liturgy. Choral music still has its attractions, even for the most complex of modernists. In my own country, Peter Maxwell Davies, a noted atheist and no friend of the Church, nevertheless wrote a quite wonderful mass setting for Westminster Cathedral. And Jonathan Harvey had a natural Anglican instinct for cathedral and church choirs. But both of these men are now dead, and the gulf is getting wider. Neither, I think, would have been inspired, unfortunately, to write functional music for the non-specialist worshipper in the pew. Unfortunately, some might say. Bernard Huybers was the foremost forerunner in the new ideas for congregational music in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. And he made the case that the new active participation should require a new kind of liturgical music and a new kind of liturgical composer. He advised that the Church's historical repertoire of sacred art music and its associated performance traditions should be abandoned. My colleague at the University of St Andrews, the musician and academic Michael Ferguson, writes, in an ideological sense too, he, Huybers, regards sacred art music as no longer having a legitimate place. And Huybers refers to art musicians and the sacred traditions of the Church as a kind of musical colonialism. It's odd to look back to see that a Catholic culture warrior of the 1960s could be so prophetic of the widespread chaos created by today's cultural warriors in the secular world, who use similar language about our entire cultural history. One could argue that this radical stance has gained much purchase in the Church of today and is the cause of many musicians turning away from liturgical concerns, and for the many clergy and liturgists who regard serious musicians as surplus to contemporary requirements, unnecessary and unwanted. Generally, it has caused bewilderment among musicians outside the Church who look at us and see a willful abandonment of tradition and practice as a kind of iconoclasm associated more with the Protestant Reformations of past centuries, or the kind of communist culture wars instigated in 1960s China, 1970s Cambodia, or in the student unions of American and British campuses of the present day. Nevertheless, there are pockets of insight where other alternative and far less destructive understandings of Catholic liturgical development hold sway. On the one hand, of course, it's still possible to compose choral music for skillful choirs and organists in the Church, usually in big cities in the UK like London and Liverpool, and in establishments where money is available for the maintenance of professional standards. And there are enough people still around in the Catholic Church who hold a much more nuanced understanding of how congregational song might be. There have been competing ideas as to how music in the liturgy might develop and grow these last 50 years, as I'm sure you're aware. On the one hand, there have been the likes of Pope Benedict XVI and others who hold that church tradition can indeed provide effective models which can give good orientation for composers in the modern age, and that post-conciliar liturgical music can be of pastoral impact in the vernacular, but can simultaneously draw deeply from the wells of Catholic heritage and sound. And then there is Edward Schaeffer, the American academic and musician, who optimistically sees the modern situation as, quote, ripe for improvement, suggesting that the various historical and ideological trends can be rebalanced. He sees an ongoing role in this for Gregorian chant. So I've certainly been aware of these different forces, sometimes pulling the Church in opposing directions on this matter and related matters. I can see potency and persuasiveness in many of the strong and sometimes vehemently opposing arguments. Over the years, I've attempted to compose congregational music myself, including 3 mass settings and various responsorial psalms based on the time when I organised music in a parish in Glasgow. I'll talk a little bit about those experiences soon and try to explain why I've come to the belated conclusion that I am no longer able to write aesthetically satisfying congregational music according to the templates that have emerged in the Catholic Anglosphere in recent decades. But, as I indicated earlier, I also write choral music specifically for the liturgy, and I have no intention of stopping that. The most pertinent body of this work to today's presentation, perhaps, is the collection of Strathclyde motets. There's 2 volumes of these, written for Alan Tavernier's chamber choir at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. And most of these were written for them to sing at the Catholic chaplaincy of the university and at the sister parish of St. Columba's in Maryhill, both served by the Dominicans up until 2017, and by myself, I suppose, until 2015. I'll talk a little bit about some of those little motets in a minute. Before then, though, just to go back to modernism and the impact of that on our lives as musicians, there was something, as I'm sure you remember, there was something in high modernism, the high modernism of the late 20th century, which favoured instrumental music over choral or even vocal music. The virtuosity and complexity, so sought after by modernist composers, could be attained more easily with instruments. In fact, a lot of the vocal music of the 20th century frontline modernists is deeply instrumental in its conception, mimicking the life and athletic twists and turns that could be achieved by instrumental specialists. Therefore, the instincts more associated with song and choir were downgraded and replaced by alternative creative priorities. This, I think, in my own life explains my temporary drifting away from choral music in my younger years, a time when I was beguiled by the pushing of boundaries associated with major modernist composers from Schoenberg to Boulez. There was also a time, at this time in the 1980s, a reticence on my part, perhaps, to show my hand as a religious composer, having been persuaded temporarily that religion had no place at the cutting edge of modern artistic endeavour. In this, I was wrong. No doubt encouraged by the likes of Olivier Messiaen, I mentioned before, and later those deeply spiritual voices emerging from the shadows of Soviet state-enforced atheism, like the Russians, Schnitke and Gubaidulina, who's still alive, Arvo Pärt from Estonia, who's also still alive, Gorecki from Poland, etc. I turned back to my original instincts and slowly but surely began building a body of work for choral forces, much of which was shaped by my liturgical and theological experiences as a Catholic. Also, it was not clear in the 70s and 80s that imminently there would be a huge resurgence of interest in choral music, which would become such a prominent feature of musical life, especially in the United Kingdom, and indeed in the lives of many composers at the end of the century and into this one. I did not foresee the intense imaginative relationship that I would eventually build with Harry Christophers, for example, the conductor of the 16. And I did not foresee just how much the new, brilliant British choral ensembles would feature in the work of the modern composer. The 16, Tenebrae, Polyphony, the Tallis Scholars, the Hilliard Ensemble, the King Singers, and Capella Nova. In fact, it would be for this last Scottish group that I would write my 7 Last Words from the Cross in 1993. Scored for choir and string ensemble, it's one of my most performed works, especially at Lent and Eastertide, as a concert work, of course, around the world. In fact, my first ever trip to this city, Philadelphia, about 20 years ago now, I heard a performance of the 7 Last Words conducted by Donald Nally, who's a great musical and choral figure in this city. And I think he might be coming along later in the week. So for a while, from about 2005, I became interested in what Edward Schaeffer described as the rebalancing of trends in liturgical music practice in the Catholic Church. As I said earlier, Pope Benedict XVI took a great interest in the church's music, and I was struck by this quote from him, speaking in the Sistine Chapel in 2006. He said, "An authentic updating of sacred music can take place in the lineage of the great tradition of the past, of Gregorian chant and sacred polyphony. This galvanized me to be involved in the John Henry Newman Institute of Liturgical Music in the UK, the Latin Mass Society, and in the establishment of Musica Sacra Scotland, which organised 2 national conferences to encourage the rejuvenation of Gregorian type chant in English and Latin for ordinary people in the liturgy." And it was lovely to hear those English Gregorian style chants at the Mass this afternoon. It also affected my compositional work too, especially when I was writing choral music specifically for the Catholic Church. I wrote a number of works for Westminster Cathedral at this time, and also these Strathclyde motets, many of which are based on chant and devised with a view that ordinary church choirs, student choirs, and amateur choirs could perform them with relative ease. All these experiences were absorbed in my choral writing and provide the basis for a lot of my thinking, technique, aesthetics, and aspirations for future work. So now I'd like to look briefly at a couple of these Strathclyde motets. I said this about my Strathclyde motets in the liner notes for one of the CDs recorded by Caprillo. I said, "There's a kind of suspended animation about them. They don't seem to go anywhere. They kind of float as an entity. And there are 1 or 2 ideas that sort of ease into being and just exist, and then it stops. I suppose this describes a musical structure that is dependent on the text and the ideas in the text, and not on any abstract musical device or parameter. And any authentic reading of the impact of liturgical music needs to stress the primacy of scriptural focus above everything else. These motets are invariably slow, largely homophonic, and sometimes plainsong derived, with ornamental passages. The suspended animation hinted at in my quote points to the pervasive timelessness in Catholic liturgy, that everyday time is left outside, and a new time, God's time, heaven's time, reaches down into our space, and we become one with it. This can bring about an introspective quality to the music which responds to these requirements. Also, most of these motets are settings of communion propers for given feast days, which respond to the moment in the Mass where the worshipper confronts his or her most personal reflections in the most sacred and most numerous moment of the liturgy, at the reception of Holy Communion. Although most of these motets were written for a fairly competent university chamber choir, there are 2 which were written specifically for my little choir of amateur volunteers at St. Columba's. And I should say, and I'm glad there's none of that choir present to hear, that these were people who, many of whom had never had any experience of choral singing at all. Most did not read music. Some of them, to be honest, couldn't sing. So it was hard work, but it was work that was very important and enjoyable to do. Yes, I honestly mean that. There was a lot of note bashing involved. I had to take my time, they had time to give in learning sometimes very, very simple music, but when they achieved it, it was a wonderful experience, I think, for them and certainly for me. So, in Splendoribus Sanctorum, amidst the splendours of the heavenly sanctuary, from 2005, has by necessity some of the most simple and most modest music in the collection. I'd like to maybe not just analyse what I've done here, just describe it to you and then play you a performance. The Plainsong original, which some of you may know from Midnight Mass at Christmas, Plainsong original is sung by the sopranos and altos over bass drones at the octave, to an octave apart, and then a kind of medieval faux bourdon effect where the tenor part simply follows the top line below in parallel fifths. You see, I don't know if you can see it from here, but from here, basically, that's what happens. There's the sopranos and altos have a rhythmicized version of the chant. The tenors sing the same material, a fifth below. Not all the basses do hold and enunciate an F syllabically throughout. That's all they do. This motet, though, has a solo trumpet part, which interjects more animated flourishes at the end of each choral phrase. The trumpet music is very different from the choral music, as you'll hear, written in 4 obbligato phrases, which are cued by the conductor ad libitum during the choral phrases, or actually more or less at the end of choral phrases, so there's a kind of overlap. And my performance notes say about this, the 4 obbligato passages are cued by the conductor during the first singing of the motet. During subsequent repetitions, the trumpeter may vary the obbligato passages by jumping from line to line or from phrase to phrase ad libitum. The trumpet should be muted in verse 3 or 4. The trumpeter ends the piece alone using cadential figures from any of the 4 passages. So it's quite Cajun in that sense, and very free. And that's the trumpet part there, with no bar lines. And basically, after the 4 iterations, he or she can just jump in anywhere and play phrases on cue. Why? Well, I was keen to bring in some student musicians to sing or play at Mass with my choir. I simply asked one of the local conservatory trumpeters to come and play at the midnight Mass at Christmas. It allowed my choir to sing something very simple while contributing to quite a complex and substantial musical structure alongside a virtuoso player in 2 different levels of music which mesh together. I think the effect is of a strange and repetitive mantra to suit the necessary reflection and mystery appropriate for communion at midnight Mass. I'll play a little bit now. conducting that, I would have more of an overlap the material, although they kept the drone going through it, but I wasn't there, so they did very well nevertheless. O Radiant Dawn was written 2 years later. This is part of this set as well. Most of these motets are in Latin, there are a couple in English. It's quite a traditional 4-part setting of an English text for Advent. I'm delighted that some of you were working on it this week in the conductor's workshops. Its motto is 16th and 17th century church music. In particular, it has an opening phrase which pays homage to O Nata Lux by Thomas Tallis. One of the great lessons from the Reformation was the desire to communicate text more clearly and audibly in choral song. The principal aspiration here was for the words to be heard and understood, hence the strongly homophonic approach in the setting. There are some melismas, but they're not very long. At the most 3 or 4 notes per syllable, however, most syllables just have one note. A second section, so the first section is O Radiant Dawn, Splendor of Eternal Light, Son of Justice, come shine on those who dwell in darkness and the shadow of death. A second section, Isaiah, or as we say back home, Isaiah, had prophesied that the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Upon those who dwelt in the land of gloom, a light has shone. It's written as a duet between the sopranos and altos, always in parallel thirds. And then the opening section is repeated like a refrain before a cadential amen, which moves into 3/4 track. I won't play it all, but it'll just give you an idea of the sound world. I've got slightly behind with my timing, so I'm going to jump to my final video and point of discussion. Earlier in my talk, I talked a little bit about congregational music, and I said that I've given up on it. I want to give a little insight on that, because I definitely do not want to discourage any of you away from writing congregational music, if that's what you want to do. And beforehand, I was in touch with some of these wonderful Americans who are doing some wonderful work in creating a body of plain song bass material, which you were using this morning. I think this is a wonderful way to go, but it is resisted, as I'm sure you are aware, for lots of different reasons. I just want to give you an insight into one of my congregational masses. As you know, Pope Benedict visited the United Kingdom in 2010, and I was delighted to be invited to write some music for the visit. And the piece I enjoyed most writing was a choral piece, but with brass and organ and lots of percussion, called Tu es Petrus. I'm not going to play that just now. It's on YouTube. You can find it filed under Star Wars. But there was another piece I was asked to write. I was asked, in fact, the bishops of Scotland got together with the bishops of England and Wales, and that never happens, to invite me to write a congregational mass. And this mass was to be for the big open air liturgies in Glasgow and in Birmingham. Now, I don't know if you remember, or even you could compare it with papal visits to the US, but nobody really knows that the Pope's coming until quite late on. So by April or May that year, there had been nothing finalised. We didn't know whether Pope Benedict was coming to the United Kingdom at all. And then suddenly we got the news he was coming in September. So I was approached, could you write a new congregational mass for September? And basically this had to be written quickly, disseminated amongst the dioceses of Scotland, England and Wales, amongst the choral groups, and to as many congregations as could imagine. And they had to learn it in a matter of weeks. And in retrospect, I shouldn't really have accepted this commission. It was almost impossible. And there were voices at the time, and they were probably right, that a congregational mass should have been something that was known by the assembly. And that could have been a Gregorian chant, of course, a Gregorian mass, or something else. But they were very keen, the bishops were very keen that I should write this. So I worked very, very hard at getting it done. It got disseminated through to all the different dioceses, and they worked very, very hard on it. And I want to show you a little video of the singing of the Gloria at the Cofton Park Mass. Now, this was the Mass where John Henry Newman was beatified. And you'll see hundreds and hundreds of choristers singing, and they all were singing beautiful gospel. It's in the open air. But what the congregation do? Well, in the missalettes, the melody lines of the Mass were printed. So, in theory, those who could read music could join in. But as we know, that is a minority of any congregation. Maybe even more so with Catholic congregations, considering the reluctance factor of many Catholic congregations to sing. Yes, I've also read Thomas Day, Why Catholics Can't Sing. So we had to get this out, and as you'll see, the choir is singing beautifully. The clergy seem to be joining in. Now and again, you see people from the congregation, and there's thousands and thousands of them reading the missalette and attempting to join in. The Pope, I don't think, is singing. But it caused a bit of a row, and I've still got the scars from the whole experience. I probably shouldn't have done it, but it was a delight to have been asked. Well, the piece is there. It had to be, it was for a papal mass, so it couldn't just be round the campfire, let's sing with a guitar kind of mass. I'm sure lots of other people would have wanted that, and there's a good place for that too, of course. So I tried to make the best of it. I added some brass and percussion parts, and But I decided that was it after the experience. I have great respect for all those who continue the struggle, and there's still a lot to be done in the decades ahead. So here is the Gloria from the Mass for John Henry Newman.
Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace and favor of men. We praise you, we bless you, we adore you.
Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I suppose with that, I've taken you on a bit of a journey. I suppose I've been saying that I have quite a varied life as a composer in the 21st century, and I've been involved in very different aspects of music making and very different aspects of sacred music. Feel free to ask any questions. Yes.
So, do you think that, like, especially in the United Kingdom, it seems to me that there's in general, there's a higher level of musical education. I think throughout schooling that might not be true compared to the United States. But a thing that I've kind of observed in churches in the US is that whenever we give people like unison hymnals all the time, that a lot of times people don't want to sing it because a lot of the parts are just not in their vocal range.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that should we be giving the congregation, if we ever give them some of the parts, is that just us putting a bomb in, in the church, or might there be something to that? I've heard arguments on both sides.
Mhm.
So,
I don't know about the comparison between the two countries as far as music education is concerned. We have our own problems in that regard, and trying to maintain education in schools, both north and south of the border. But as far as, and I've been to the US a lot, and I tried to compare the two different types of congregational approaches. I would say American congregations sing with more gusto than British congregations. That gave a false impression of what it's like back home. But the question is, I suppose, how do they cope with new material being given to them all the time? And there has been almost a fetish of the new in the church. We've got to get new congregational masses at them all the time, and but the aesthetic never really changes very much. And that aesthetic has been inculcated more in the US than in the United Kingdom, but we've picked up on that, and we use a lot of the congregational masses that have been disseminated in the US. Personally, I find that a lot of them very sentimental and unfitting. So for the temple, as they say. But so any attempt to try to go beyond that, I think is important. And, well, that's one way, I suppose. I don't think it works, but the better way is to do what you were doing this afternoon, exploring the possibilities of this, the lines of plain song, the shape of plain song, which lies deep in the Catholic memory. It is the sound of Catholicism. And some of those plain song melodies can be the most simple. Look at that Kyrie. It's a call and response, but that was a beautiful rendition. Why can it not always be like that? You know, if the choir scholars sing that one single phrase, the congregation would and did respond. I noticed people around about. I don't know if they were used to it here in Philadelphia, but they know that they've got to react without music. They will respond to a simple phrase like that. And that might be a consideration for some of the mass moments. Yes.
How would you summarize the phrase full active conscious participation?
Yeah.
Making the distinction between action as singing and action as maybe listening to a motet.
Yeah, well, I've never been convinced by this argument that congregations have to be all singing, all dancing. The participation is internal, or can be internal, and that the choir singing expertly a motet by Palestrina or whoever are providing a huge spiritual service for the rest of the congregation, because they are allowing the prayers and reflections of the congregation to be carried in sound by others, by those who have the expertise, to the very altar of God. That's a form of participation that is just as valid, just as powerful, just as prayerful as singing everything, which is, I don't think, the intention that we did that. And it's been used as a hammer to beat those of us who are musicians in the church. It's been used as a hammer sometimes to do away with choirs. It certainly was the case in the United Kingdom in the 1970s. And that should never have happened. It's the musical version of a recovation, which is the wrecking and innovation of church buildings that happened at the same time. Yes.
Sir James, you've spoken of, in terms of the music you're writing for the concert hall, and openness to subjects of your faith, openness to subjects of spirituality. I find it interesting that at least a few of your works touch very deeply on the suffering of Christ, the passion settings, the 7 last words. When I think of it, I can think of a few other secular choral works that are focused on the passion of Christ, but Christ is substituted. For instance, the Little Maestro Passion. Even considering Matthew Shepherd, which tends to take a lens, taking elements of Christ's passion, looking at that tragedy. So I'm wondering if you can speak to this subject. Is there something about this subject of suffering? In fact, Christ's suffering, maybe, that is a kind of bridge to the secular world. Do you think there's something to that?
I would like to think so, and there is no reason to take Christ out of the equation in the discussion. And there are many well-meaning Christians who think that's the way to be with their secular counterparts, that you play down the Christ element of the religion in order to, I don't know, be more friendly or something like that. I don't know. I wonder if you noticed that the very nice German director, who I like very much, and I quite liked what he did, but he never once mentioned Christ. He wanted this to be a human story, I think. He had to engage with Christ. It's all about Christ. So that was a problem if he wanted to ignore it. But I think he would rather have ignored it. And you do find a lot of people, believers as well as non-believers, who are nervous about talking about their faith. I was at a music festival. Oh.
I think it's the machinery in the building.
Right, okay.
I think it's okay.
Right, it's not a new piece by Adolf Perks. Yeah, a festival director who was talking about singers who would come and perform excerpts from Bach cantatas at his festival, but were very, very anxious about anything that mentioned Christ. So they would deliberately go for the text that didn't mention Christ. And I thought, this is just crazy. And why is it that it's Christianity that's the only religion that has to censor itself in this way when we engage with the rest of the world? I don't think that's the way to go. As I said earlier, I think that there's a great respect amongst the musical community for where this musical culture has come from. They might not be believers, many of them, but they know that the reason the Bach passions are the way they are, and the reason the Bach passions are the masterpieces that they are, is because of the Christian context in which they were written, the Christian fervour that made Bach write those pieces, and it's the same all through musical history, and even today that might discomfort people. It might discomfort some secularists who don't like the idea that there's religious fervour still in the hearts of their fellows. But that religious fervour is there. It can be very, very creative. I'd like to think it's what motivates me to write the music. And so far, I haven't really encountered any significant resistance to it. There's a genuine receptivity and understanding. Well, that's where it's coming from, and I hope that always exists. There are other branches of the arts where that receptivity isn't there anymore, and it's much more difficult sometimes in film or in visual arts or literature for Christians to speak to the big wider audience as Christians. Maybe poetry is different. I know many poets who can express a luminousness in an elusive religious language that gets through. So there's something about music and perhaps poetry that is, as these people say, the most spiritual of the arts. And it's that common ground that believer and non-believer, believer and non-believer music lover can forge bonds together. Yes.
As a composer of what I might term high art music for the secular concert world, do you find that in dealing with, in trying to bring high art music to the church world, that the challenges are more theological than musical? That what is the disconnect in the desire for art and the iconoclastic impulses lies more at a theological level than at a music or art appreciation level?
Well, whether this is a good thing or not for the world of music, there is a receding knowledge of scripture, a receding, a disappearing knowledge and engagement with the Bible. And so people are coming to the crucifixion story sometimes for the first time. I've had this many times when I set my St. John and St. Luke so far in English. And there are many, especially young people, who have had no religious education at all in secular state schools, are hearing the Passion story for the first time. And they're hearing it like a courtroom drama as far as the St. John is concerned. It's as if it's a brand new story for them. And in many ways, that's an opportunity for those of us of faith to speak to the blank page. We are starting again in our culture with our faith and engaging with people who don't know anything about it. And that ignorance, let's call it for what it is, we should be aware of it and maybe regard it as an opportunity for us to engage and to bring the theology to the discussion. Sometimes for people, so for some people for the very first time.
You find that in your interactions with other Catholics that different understandings of what Catholicism is or what the liturgical services are is a hindrance to advancing art music in the church?
That's a very different question, but also a very interesting one. I don't know what it's like here, but in the UK there has been a pervading Philistinism in Catholic circles about the concept of beauty in liturgy. They get truth, they see its place, they get goodness, we should absolutely engage it, but beauty baffles many. And in essence, the three of them are interlinked. You can't have one without the other two. And so to be able to explain to people who may be dismissive of the role of beauty, or indeed high art, as it might be in some cases, is another opportunity. We are starting afresh. There has been iconoclasm after iconoclasm in Christian history, well before Vatican II, if you like. So we've had to live with that, and we've had to live with the idea that many in the churches have wanted to reform so much that the casualty was always music. And you can see why. Sometimes it's not just the Protestant Reformation, but even the Council of Trent demanded a way of approaching text that composers had to respond to. Composers can do that as long as we're not cancelled completely, which is what I think sometimes happens in the church. Yeah.
Mentioned that the art music and liturgical music don't overlap very much these days. I'm wondering, who else do you know who's trying to bring them together? And does it always have to be a choral route? Can it be done instrumentally?
It could be done instrumentally, but I don't know of any examples of that yet. It's a tricky question because I'd be very. I find it hard to think who my colleagues are, because even the ones who I admire and whose work is performed in the church, and many of the churches, like Isobel Gowdie, doesn't actually write music specifically for liturgy. It's taken up by liturgical choirs. Actually, Isobel Gowdie's music is very difficult, and sometimes even willing amateur choirs can find it hard. I'm sure you've encountered that in the past. Well, he's dead now, but John Taverner was a very interesting man. I had some very interesting conversations with John Taverner. In a sense, he understood liturgy. I suppose Isobel does too, but John Taverner was more involved with the churches in England especially. He knew there was a thirst for this music in the cathedral choir tradition. I found a common bond with him. It's very interesting conversations with him. We didn't always agree on theology, but he's dead. He's no longer with us. So who else is there? I think there's got to be a new generation to come up. and we await that generation.
Do you think that one of the reasons that so many like Christians, whoever, is because of a lot of high art music or not, a lot of high art now is just for kind of the shock factor. Black terms is just to desensitize you.
Yes, and I think you find that a lot in many aspects of contemporary culture. It's a big conversation. I won't go down that route just now, but I think you're right. Many in the church regard the world of culture as having abandoned it and have moved in a very different direction. Interestingly, though, there have been a number of popes in recent times who have reached out to those in culture beyond the church. John Paul's letter to artists in 1999 is a very important document, where in a sense he's embracing the possibility of discussion, engagement, and in doing so brought in a lot of skeptical artists into an ongoing discussion with the church. I think that can continue, and Pope Paul VI also wrote to artists. I'd like to see that happen again, like from the top, a sign that the church wants to reach out to culture generally. So we don't necessarily go different ways, and that the church can invite people in to see a truly more authentic version of what beauty is, beauty in the modern world.
Thank you very much, James.